So it's high summer and we're actually getting some sunspots. Who's up for a simple one tube type project? And I've been looking at some of the old ham radio project books from the 60s and 70s. And what caught my eye was a one tube transmitter for 10 meters or for 6 meters. And that's interesting. Anytime somebody says, oh, one tube, you know, sometimes you've got these projects and it says one tube, but it's really a fancy triple compactron tube that you can't possibly get your hands on. And I'm talking about one tube, and really one tube. And this is going to be an AM transmitter. It can use almost any RF tube that has a suppressor grid, because the suppressor grid is what we're going to modulate. So you could use something as small as a 6BH6. Okay. So just about any type of tube that can be used that has a suppressor grid on board. I like to use very common tubes for projects like this, so you don't have to go hunting and paying high prices to get a tube. So you could use a military surplus tube like a 5763, like a 6CL6, the driver tube in a lot of the Heathkit stuff. But TV sets used a lot of these 12BY7s. This is a beam power tube that's very common, very inexpensive type tube. I think I'll base it on this just for simplicity. We should be able to get maybe a watt out, something like that on 10 meters, maybe a little bit more. And we'll see if we can suppressor grid modulate 12BY7. I have gone as high as something like an 837, and you can get about 10 watts out with a tube like this if you have a big enough power supply. So again, we're going to use a crystal. It could be a fundamental crystal right at 29.1 or 29.2 megahertz. That's the AM portion of the 10 meter band that we're going for. Or it could be half that frequency, or in this case a third of that frequency. This is a 9.74 megahertz crystal. We're going to triple this up to the 10 meter band. You could be using crystals that multiply up to this frequency. This will be a very tolerant oscillator circuit, and in the final it will automatically multiply up to the 10 meter band. So with the sunspot cycle we have, we'll do a nice antenna project for 10 meters, and we'll see if we can make a 10 meter AM contact using our little peanut tube transmitter. So the first thing it says, this is out of 101 Easy Ham radio projects. So this is an early 70s type project book. The first thing it says on this one tube, 50 megahertz phone rig. See, we're going to do it at 28, 29 megahertz, but they actually went as far as to do it at 50 megahertz. It says, you will not be QSOing Germany on this rig, but you will be surprised at the 6 or 10 meter fun you will have with this completely self-contained 50 megahertz AM transmitter. Sure, it's low power, but one constructor has already snagged 40 states on 6 meters with this little flea-powered DX transmitter. So here we go, one tube.
Okay, are you guys ready to talk about a one tube transmitter? And this is pretty exciting because making a 6 or a 10 meter transmitter using one tube, especially using a lower frequency crystal and multiplying up, it's pretty tricky. And they're using an interesting circuit called the Trite Oscillator. It really means triode tetrode. The triode portion is basically oscillating the crystal on its fundamental, and the tetrode portion is tuned to one of the harmonics of the crystal. The magic or the tricky part of this circuit is setting the cathode tuned circuit. Basically, this tuned circuit is not actually tuned to the crystal's frequency. It's usually set about 1.5 times that frequency. So if we had a 10 megahertz rock, we would be tuning this up around 15 megahertz. So for our 9 or 10 megahertz rock that we have that we're tripling up to 10 meters, it's going to be in that range. It's going to be 13, 14, 15 megs with this tuned circuit. Also notice it's fixed because you don't want to be fooling around with this. Once set roughly, you don't need to touch it again because if you do happen to hit resonance with the rock, you could crack the crystal. So let's go on. Let's look at the circuit that was in 101 Easy Ham Radio Projects by Robert Brown and Tom Nitel, two very famous hams and experimenters and authors from the 1960s and 70s. Basically, they've got all of their notebook of circuits over their lifetime, and they put together these 101 Easy Ham Radio Projects, and maybe they tested a few of them, maybe some of them were already validated, but they put them all in the book and expected you to be able to handle the high voltage and the circuitry without causing lethal consequences. And believe me, this is an example of a questionable schematic, questionable circuit. There's some techniques used here that might raise the hackles on some people's necks. So first of all, we have the basic Trite Oscillator up above. The Trite tank is right here, and this is tuned for 6 meters here. So if we were using a fundamental crystal, by the way, for instance a 28 megahertz rock in a 28 megahertz transmitter, you do not need these components. You simply short the crystal to ground, and it's a conventional electron coupled oscillator. But if we are doubling, tripling, quadrupling, etc., you do need the Trite tank that makes the grid circuit oscillate, and the plate circuit allows power to be drawn without upsetting the grid too much. So that's the secret of the Trite oscillator. Now, as far as the voltage goes, they're using a transformer that has a 250 volt secondary. 250 volts rectified would be somewhat high voltage enough, but they're doing voltage doubling too. So that's 250 volts times 2.8 or 700 volts. 700 volts on the plate of the tube, and putting it through a regular switch, by the way. These are all questionable and dangerous practices. This little peanut tube, the 6BH6, probably is rated at 200 to 400 volts. I can't imagine that it would like 700 volts, but I'm not going to judge. These guys probably knew what they were doing. So the voltage doubler, what else do we need? Oh, we need a negative bias for the suppressor grid. The suppressor grid is how we're going to cut the tube off. It's how we're going to modulate it. So by making the suppressor grid really negative, the output power goes way down. By bringing it closer to ground, the output power goes all the way up. Okay, a quick review of the Pentode tube. Remember, the Pentode is different than a tetrode because it has an extra grid, grid 3, which we call the suppressor grid. Now, the reason the suppressor grid was added is something called secondary emissions, or secondary electrons were bouncing off the plate and getting back down into the screen and control grid, causing distortion. So by adding a suppressor grid and connecting it to ground, that essentially stopped those bouncing electrons from causing trouble in the tube. So modern power pentodes, for instance, used in audio, use this suppressor grid to decrease distortion. So in a tetrode tube, secondary electrons from the plate will be collected by the screen grid at low swings of the plate voltage. But with a pentode, the zero bias of the suppressor grid turns back the secondary electrons. Also, when we are controlling that suppressor grid, as we are going to do by putting audio on it and modulating the carrier, we're basically setting the carrier point to be about 50%, and that'll take so many negative volts on the suppressor grid. As we modulate, we drive that closer to 0, more output, or more negative. So this is the idea of having 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 volts of negative bias on that suppressor grid as our operating point. And then as we modulate, we move that bias up and down, and therefore we are controlling the power output of the stage. So we are modulating from a negative voltage, a negative bias, to ground. And that sine wave that comes out of here with our speech or whatever, the varying AC waveform, modulates the 70 volt bias on the suppressor grid, therefore causing AM modulation. How are we making the negative 70 or negative 100 bias, by the way? Well, he's doing that by inserting a 4.7K resistor in the ground return lead. If we assume we have 15 or 20 milliamps of plate current, it's simply I times R, Ohm's law, and we end up developing a voltage across this point. So it is negative in respect to ground. Isn't that interesting? And so I don't know about you guys, but I get very excited about strange looking circuits like this voltage doubler that I don't understand on the surface, and I just want to try to figure out what these guys were doing. And it really is a genius circuit that they put in this book for this particular little 1-watt transmitter. So first of all, the voltage doubler portion, we've got 250 volts AC, that's RMS voltage, and we're multiplying that by 2.82, that's the voltage doubler, 2 times the peak voltage. So we get 705 volts theoretically. So let's call that 700 volts. So we know between this point and this point, we're going to have 700 volts. So between here and here, we have 700 volts total. Now it's kind of hard to figure out the circuit unless you draw in the load. And the load, of course, is our oscillator. So I kind of figured out that the input power was going to be around 10 watts on this thing. So I just put 15 milliamps as the predicted load. And I figured out that we had an equivalent resistance of 42K. So that's the equivalent resistance of the oscillator load right here. Now they have this 4.7K resistor in here, and it looks like they're expecting to get about a 10 to 1 voltage division. So we would end up with 630 volts from this point to this point. It's interesting, they made the ground point arbitrary, and they put it right here. Instead of putting it here, as we normally would with a voltage doubler, instead of putting it at the bottom of the bottom capacitor with a conventional voltage doubler, they put it in the middle of the voltage divider. This is really interesting, and it made an arbitrary 0 volts, meaning that some of that 700 volts is going to be across R3. And if you do Kirchhoff's voltage law around the loop, you find out that this is indeed negative 70 volts when referenced to the arbitrary point, the 0 volts point. So if we take the 630 volts we've got left for the actual circuit and multiply that by the 15 milliamps, we end up with 9.5 watts input power. Now they claim they got 1 watt out, so that means this thing can't be any more efficient than 9.5%. 9.5% overall efficiency for their 6-meter oscillator. I believe that. It's especially if they're using an 8 megahertz rock and somehow quadrupling up to 6 meters, that you're not going to get any more efficiency than that. So now we understand the power supply circuit and can move on. Now on the carbon microphone, another device that requires bias, he's simply rectifying the 6.5 3 volts AC and getting something between 6 and 9 volts for the carbon microphone. Now as you talk, it's like a variable resistor, so it's going to make a varying AC voltage on the primary stepped up by the transformer. So you want a very high ratio transformer. Something called a microphone transformer would be ideal. It would be a few ohms up to a few k ohms, or a few hundred k ohms, even better. Developing higher and higher voltage on the secondary is how we get 100% modulation. So that's about as far as I want to go with the schematic, other than it's a little scary. Ah yes, the 6BH6 Pentode, the little peanut tube, is only rated to 300 volts. And I looked at the curves, and I think they tested up to about 450 volts. So, wink wink, they're exceeding the ratings. The transformer, the power transformer, it's not big. It's a small transformer, 25 milliamps. Yes, with those 2 capacitors, it could potentially give you a terrible shock, maybe even lethal, but it's not going to fry you. And now we look at the parts list. Remember, these are all 1960s style parts, and it is for 50 megahertz. We will be modifying some of these values to work best at 10 meters, which is our band of interest. So let me read the whole article to you guys, because you'll be whining if I don't do something like that. You will not be QSOing Germany with this rig, but you will be surprised at the 6-meter fun you will have with this completely self-contained 50 megahertz AM transmitter. Sure, it's low power, but one constructor has already snagged 40 states on 6 with its little Flea Power DX transmitter, and all with a 4-element Yagi. Well, 4-element Yagi on 6 should work pretty well, right? As with other VHF projects, wiring should be kept short with no recommended bypass capacitors omitted from your version. Yes, M1 is a standard 8.333 megahertz or whatever crystal, although you can use 16, 25, or 50 megahertz crystals with the unit as well. If you're using 50 megahertz crystals, start with L1 at minimum inductance, slug all the way out, and adjust L2 for maximum output at the antenna. Keep adjusting C6 and L2 for maximum output, trimming occasionally with L1. With other crystals, start with the slug of L1 about halfway out, then proceed as above. L1, incidentally, should always be tuned slightly higher than the crystal frequency, although its setting is not at all critical. Once preset as above, all future tuning, changing the crystal frequency, new antennas, etc., should be accomplished with C6, L2, and L3. Incidentally, we forgot to mention power output. It's 1 watt with the power supply shown. Absolutely amazing to get 1 watt out of something like this. But then I saw how high the voltage is. That poor little tube, he must have been pretty hot fella. Before we finish up this introductory video into the simple 10-meter one-tube transmitter, I just wanted to go through the power transformer situation. Now, just because this says 101 easy ham radio projects, that does not mean that some of these projects are not dangerous to life. And I'm talking about high voltages, and we have to take that seriously when we're dealing with high voltage. The other problem with a project like this is it's so dated that the transformers that you need, especially the audio transformers and the voltage power transformers that you need, have become fairly rare, and if not rare, then fairly expensive. And even a simple beginner's project like this, you're going to end up paying between $30 and $50 for an appropriate transformer for a small project like this. So this happens to be a good choice if you were to use a 6CL6, 6-volt tube, 6BH6, and so on. This was the one that they recommended in the article. Looks like you could still get one possibly. Who knows? Out of stock? Not a good look, I don't think. If you go to Mauser, DigiKey, or Allied, or any of the other distributors, you can find Hammond type transformers that are appropriate. Here's one that it's 250 volts center tapped, and it also has bias winding. It could be 6 volts or it could be 12 volts. It depends on the model that you get. Again, these transformers do exist. You're going to pay a little bit of money for them, however. Here's 262 series. I like this one because it has a 120 volt secondary as well as a filament. And that 120 volts, I think if we put that into the doubler, we would have a little more reasonable voltage for these small tubes. So if I do one of these, it's going to be a transformer like this. I'm not going to attempt to do the 700 volts. I'm going to bring it down a little bit and see if we can scale it. Now the price for that might be the power output is a little less than we're getting in that project, but I just don't want to tempt the devil by putting 700 volts on a tube that's only rated to 300. Anyway, in the next edition, we're going to start to collect parts, mount things on the chassis, see if we can get this thing to oscillate.